Hi, I'm Sabrina Dellin, the CEO of the Samara Centre for Democracy. Thanks for joining us for this special webinar with the Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences titled From Peer Review to the Public, Reimagining Academia for Civic Life. The Samara Centre works to make our country's democracy more accessible, responsive, and inclusive. Inherent to this work is an understanding that Indigenous laws, systems of governance, and ways of knowing are foundational to what we now understand as Canada's approach to democracy. So, as we begin today, I'd like to acknowledge the land that I'm joining you from is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. This is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and we encourage you to reflect on the history of the land that you're joining us from today. Today, we are exploring how the humanities and social sciences shape our understanding of civic life, power, and participation. History, sociology, political science, these aren't just academic disciplines, they provide tools for building informed and active citizens. But here's the tension. This is a moment of democratic backsliding where universities are being challenged, even threatened. How can scholars respond at this moment? And what's their role in strengthening Canada's democracy? This is a timely conversation ahead of the Congress of the Humanities and Social Sciences, which is organized by the Federation and will take place at George Brown College in Toronto from May 30th to June 6th. This is Canada's largest academic gathering, and it brings together more than 7,000 researchers, policymakers, and community members to share knowledge, collaborate, and build meaningful connections. It's my pleasure now to introduce our speakers. I'll start with our panelists. Dr. Debra Thompson is an associate professor of political science and the Canada Research Chair in Racial Inequality in Democratic Societies at McGill University. She is also a board member at the Federation and the Samara Centre. We also have with us today Dr. Beatrice Wayne, Director of Research and Policy at the Samara Centre and one of the founders of the Student Vote Research Network. Moderating our conversation is Duncan, an Associate Professor and Carty Chair in Journalism, Diversity and Inclusion at Carleton University, and the co-founder of the much-beloved Media Girlfriends. Welcome to you all, and I'll pass the microphone on to you, Nanaba. Have a great conversation.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Sabrina. And thank you to everyone who is joining us today. Dr. Deb Thompson and Dr. Beatrice Wayne, thank you too for having this conversation with me. I really appreciate being part of this conversation. So today we're actually going to start with the critical role that the social sciences and humanities play in shaping active and informed and engaged citizens. And I'm going to start with you, Debra. When it comes to shaping informed and engaged citizens, what would you say is the responsibility that the social sciences and humanities have?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here and thanks for the question, Inaba. I like that word responsibility. I want to zero in on it for a second because it really is such a privilege to be able to exist in university life on college campuses, to teach young people, to see them decide who they want to be for, at least the next little while that we get to engage with them. And it is a deep responsibility, I think, that we have in the social sciences and humanities to continually engage with students to ensure that when they enter in our classrooms, they have the ability to argue, to think critically, to challenge. They have a certain degree of academic freedom, just as faculty have a certain degree of academic freedom. And our hope, I think, our continual hope is that by engaging with the social sciences and humanities, our students will develop critical thinking skills, empathy, and get to engage in the world of diverse viewpoints, including ones that they don't like, including ones that they don't agree with at all. And then it's it's so rare that we get to like seriously engage with people that we disagree with. And this is, being in university is a prime time, I think, for that to happen. The challenge here, of course, is I would say one of our biggest challenges is just access. Like we as a society, we are not educating most of our population. The majority of the Canadian population does not have a university degree. We do quite well, especially compared to other countries in the OECD,
Mhm.
but I think that the financial barriers to attending university are quite large for a huge part of the population. And I think that we do need to do much more work in demonstrating the value of the social sciences and humanities to folks who like want to do it, who dream of doing it,
Mhm.
but their parents want them to, I don't know, be an engineer or something, and so they dismiss the validity and the importance of these disciplines out of hand without ever thinking about all that we could potentially offer them.
Mhm. Beatrice, I see you nodding. Now you're a historian. How would you say that disciplines like anthropology and philosophy and sociology, how would you say that these disciplines move from the classroom into the realities of civic life? Do you think that they can actually help people every day, or is it stuck in theory?
That's a really good question. And I think they do. And I think it's really through the methods and the skill sets of research that are so crucial to those disciplines, to history, to sociology, to anthropology. And I think also the way in which those fields force you, like Deb was talking about, to engage in perspectives that are not your own, whether those are perspectives of somebody from the 19th century that are very different from you, but to think about them, analyze them, engage with them, and then in classrooms talk about them with other people who have diverse viewpoints. I think that those are practices of democracy and they're crucial skills for democratic engagement. And I also think when I talk about skills and methods, I mean reading sources really closely,
Mm.
fine-grained reading, understanding
Original
where
sources, right?
yeah, yeah, exactly. And understanding where sources come from, being able to even do that research of tracking down a source through various means, using databases, research databases, and then sort of analyzing the citations, really thinking about what primary, secondary sources are. All of those things are really useful in civic life. It allows you to look at
Mm.
candidates' platforms and put them in a context. It allows you to see where, when someone's making an argument, it's not actually founded in a lot of good evidence. It allows you to speak to your neighbor and have a conversation about things you disagree with, but you've had practice at that. So it's not really distressing in the same way. All of
Mm.
these are skills that are really honed in these humanity classrooms.
Mm.
And I'd also say, often when we talk about things like history, anthropology, sociology, we think of the course content in a really narrow way. So we'll see something like 19th century British food culture, and you'll
Hmm.
think, okay, that's incredibly niche. Like, who really needs to know about that?
Hmm.
But then when you dig into it, there are so many things involved in that. You're learning about tariffs, you're learning about trade, you're learning about racial hierarchies of the way food is consumed, you're learning about gendered and racialized labor in food production. There are all of these topics and themes that you get a historical background on then that actually are really helpful in thinking through contemporary issues of our society.
Mm.
And I think that it's having that ability to think through in these contexts for thinking through things that we're continuing to grapple with that is really powerful and such a luxury and wonderful thing to be able to do in humanities classrooms. Actually, I'll take that back. I won't say luxury. I think it's a critical need.
Mm. When it comes to, I'm looking at you, Deb, now. When it comes to these topics that might originally seem or at first blush seem super niche, but then you dig deep and you get to learn more. Do you think that those disciplines within the social sciences and humanities are actually giving people what they need to understand power and systems and questioning systems and then moving on to actually take meaningful civic action? Like, do you think that this actually moves people to action?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's a really great question, and I agree with Beatrice about the importance of teaching students how to research and how to dig deep and how to discern, especially in the era that we live in now, the difference between accurate, verifiable information and whatever ChatGPT has come up with, which is, I'm sure we're going to get into these types of conversations during this webinar, but man, the technology has evolved so quickly, and it's so good. It really is amazing, and it's increasingly difficult to find out to discern actual verifiable information from made up, from misinformation, disinformation, and that is quite harmful to our democracy, as I think the work from the Samara Centre demonstrates pretty clearly. So whether or not we are equipping folks with the ability to really engage with issues of power and critiques of power, yes, I think we do a very good job at that. I think we do a less good job at the what comes next, at the building. We're laying out, yeah, I can speak for myself. Like, I'm so good at criticizing, systems of power, much less good at building or offering suggestions for what can come next. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I think that comes out of a purview that recognizes the world is vast and complicated. And these very simplistic solutions to complicated social, economic, political, legal challenges are never going to be sufficient. And so,
Solutions coming from the universities, like from social sciences and humanities, or solutions coming from somewhere else?
well, I'm a political scientist, so I'm thinking specifically about policy solutions to particular issues, and they're always going to be, they should be complicated, because the problems are increasingly complicated, and so I think that giving our students, giving our other folks who engage with universities, including folks in the community, a sense of the scope of the problem is a good start to begin to think about, adequate solutions. I do think we don't do a good enough job of offering those solutions. And
Why do you think that is?
I think because problems are complicated. I think because problems are complicated. I think because, in the world that I deal with, which again is like politics, if we are lucky, we get a majority government situation for 4 to 5 years. That is not a very long time in the world of political action, and we're talking about the Canadian case, 4 to 5 years is a very long time for a government. If we're talking about the American case, House of Representatives, members are elected for 2-year terms. It's really challenging to come up with complicated, nuanced solutions to longstanding issues within a very short time frame. And so I think the predisposition is to think of solutions that are fast, that are snappy, that will get you the votes, that will get you the financing, that will win you more campaign money. And this is the world of politics again. This is what I deal with. And what we actually need are like careful, deliberate, nuanced analyses. And that is precisely what we are trying to teach students in the social sciences and humanities.
Beatrice, what were you nodding about?
A lot of what Deb was saying was really resonating. I think also there's two things that I would add would be an issue of time, because, that's something in Deb, your Globe and Mail article, which is great. You make the point that high quality research, that takes time and engagement, and you need to sit with it, and you need to test it. And in the fast moving world of politics, you don't necessarily have that quick turnaround time. And we'll get into this, but I think that's a way in which nonprofits, community organizations, and academics who have that time and space for those longer term research projects can really work together to work on policy solutions and suggestions that bring together these different worlds. But I would also say that there is also, I think, an incentive issue with providing solutions. And I don't think that the university institution incentivizes social science and humanities researchers to engage in that.
Why?
Because that is a long-term sort of structure of the university. And I think also there is a concern of the political impact of that, that there is still, I think, and Deb, I'd be very interested in your thoughts on this, but there's a truth to the idea of the ivory tower where research is separate and special, and it is a marketplace of ideas that shouldn't be sullied by being part of the political project of a country. But I also think sometimes there's just the inertia of a long-standing institution that does things in a certain way, and it's hard to get out of that. And right now, the system of research and tenure, which is one that rewards monographs and articles specifically, and does not reward community engagement, that has existed for a long time. And there needs to be, it will be a dramatic shift to change that. And any sort of institution that is ingrained is hard to move and shift in new directions, and there has to be a lot of incentive to do that.
What do you think it would take for us to invest in them like they matter?
There is a lot I could say about that, but I think that one thing is to get into that sort of in specifics what we could do. Not all universities even have offices of community engagement. I think that would be not just having them, but staffing them well. There's really high turnover in offices of community engagement. So often when NGOs or community groups reach out to a contact, that contact isn't even there at the university anymore. There isn't, they don't have these long-standing trusted relationships. And I think particularly with small community groups, that's so critical, that trust. So a huge thing to do would be having well-staffed, well-resourced offices of community engagement that faculty were incentivized to work with, that there was rewards for faculty for working and engaging with the community. It's not just something they sort of have to do on their free time because they believe in it. It's something that adds to their tenure portfolio. It's something in a substantive way, not in a tiny way, but a substantive way, something that they're encouraged or even asked to incorporate into their classroom, some sort of a capstone project where they work with the community with students. There are lots of different structural ways that this could be incentivized that I think it's not currently being.
We're going to talk more about community engagement, but first, Debra, you recently wrote an opinion piece in the Globe and Mail. It's called "What is Happening to Higher Education in the U.S. Right Now Is Not Reform, It Is Destruction." How would you say that Trump's recent showdown, as you call it, with universities impacts how the social sciences and humanities help to shape informed citizens?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I mean, the Trump administration's many directives and attacks that impact what universities have done are, to be clear, specifically directed at the social sciences and humanities. The sciences have gotten caught up in it, in part because I think this administration is very anti-science and anti-environment and anti-climate change and anti-many things. But really, a lot, I think, of the rationale for what the Trump administration is doing is because of their feeling that universities have been, quote, ideologically captured by the left. And that's, I said quote because that's from Christopher Rufo, who's a journalist and a longstanding conservative commentator. And he's largely been responsible for giving the Trump administration a blueprint for dismantling DEI in universities and across American social life. So yeah, I think that one of the lessons from the Trump administration, I think for me, has been how quickly and how easily it was done. We talk about universities as being very slow to change. Beatrice, I couldn't agree more with what you spoke about, incentives for doing particular things and not doing particular things. And my goodness, Trump came along and taught us that it is in fact, change is in fact possible, very quickly, a destructive kind of change. And it makes me very concerned, I think, for what could happen in Canada, because so much of what we value, I think, in the social sciences and humanities and in university and life in Canada is just a matter of norms. Governments generally don't interfere in the business of universities, besides cutting funding, which of course has happened across the country, because governments like respect academic freedom. Um, but that's easily, it's easily eroded. It's so easily eroded. And so, especially given some of the recent legislation here in Quebec around Anglophone institutions, it's recently been struck down by a Quebec Superior Court. But it gives me great pause for the ways in which we think about academic freedom, the ways in which we think that we are insulated from some of these more regressive forces that are now characterizing politics.
Did you want to add something, Beatrice, to that?
Um, I also share those deep concerns, I guess, is what I would add. Yeah.
The thing that comes to mind is that, Deb, when you're talking about the swiftness with which this has happened, I can't help but think, and maybe I'm just way too positive to think this way, but I can't help but think if it can happen that way, why can't it happen the other way? Why can't that swiftness be applied in a constructive manner rather than like a destructive manner? Um,
Yeah.
and I wonder if could that be a lesson for Canada? I don't know.
I love that. I love that. That is a great lesson to take. That change can go either way.
Hmm.
And so while in the US we're looking at the decimation of funding regimes, right? So NSF, NIH, the National Endowment for the Humanities, they've all had their budgets slashed, and
Hmm.
we're looking at changes that could be made very quickly. Like the federal government absolutely could just give more funding to SSHRC and CIRC,
Yeah.
CIHR, and this is where a lot of my concern comes from is those funding agencies are crucial to everything we do in Canada. They're so important. And should any particular federal government iteration of a federal government choose to slash funding from those granting agencies, we cannot do our work as professors, and not only in the social sciences and humanities, but across all disciplines. It's just the way that funding regimes work in Canada. They are just incredibly important. So yes, fund them, continue to fund them more,
Yeah.
please.
And you know what you mentioned Shirk, and maybe Shirk is going to come up here in these questions now because we're going to get into civic engagement and just the culture in academia. Beatrice, you touched on this a bit, but how would you say that these disciplines are falling short in building lasting relationships to with communities?
I think so. As I said, the lack of sort of incentives to connect with communities, but I think also there's some issues of training where students are trained in methods and skills, but they're not trained in reaching out to communities and building these relationships, how to go about it, why it's important, how to build trust. And I think that that is a crucial and should be part of the pedagogy of all of these disciplines. I think, I was lucky in my training as a historian, a lot of my sources were oral histories. So I had theories of engaging with community. But that's fairly specific to me. And I have to say, for my position in this job, as a nonprofit where we work with academics and we really are happy to, I've had a lot of outreach from graduate students that I would describe the outreach as sort of condescending and not particularly an extractive and not particularly sort of versed in methods of community engagement. And I understand that they are not, I can sort of come from the perspective of understanding a lack of training, but it makes it very hard. And it particularly for community organizations that already are existing in a space of some distrust of academia as an institution. And so there has more work that needs to be done by academics to really build that relationship.
Can
So
you can you take that thought further? Like, what does that mean then? What is the impact of having somebody who may lack that training and then they're communicating with a community in a way that is condescending or whatever? What is the impact of that?
I mean, the impact is huge then. It means that, first of all, that they're not gaining key sources that's crucial for them to do their research. It means that groups are being left out of data and research that's crucial to understand and to create good policy that can support these underrepresented groups. But it also means that whatever is produced is not going to feel relevant to these groups, and it's that they're going to, I think, develop potentially a sense of distrust of research more broadly. I think that has a very damaging civic effect, much broader than it would seem for like just one poorly written email. I think that there can be cascading effects from that are dangerous. Why it's so crucial to teach and train students in that outreach. But I would also add that I think that this isn't an individual faculty or an individual student issue. This is a systemic issue, and we need institutional buy-in from the administration, again, to incentivize this sort of training and this sort of outreach.
So I would agree with it coming from my discipline through journalism. If you're trying to, and my research practice is about reporting in Black communities, and for me, what I would say is that if you have journalists or student journalists who are trying to communicate with Black communities who have a history of mistrust with journalism and the media, then you're not help. It really can, like a badly worded email or a condescending email can actually be quite bad for a potential collaboration. So for you, Debra, what does genuine collaboration look like? Equitable collaboration?
Yeah, I know that there are various guidelines about this. SureCare certainly has guidelines for working with Indigenous communities. And it's tough, and I think the thing that I would want to emphasize is that building trust with communities and creating projects where the outputs benefit the communities and you're not just extracting knowledge for your tenure file or whatever. That takes a lot of time. And time is a scarce resource. It is certainly in academia, like not just because we as professors or faculty members have a lot of other things to do, but because the incentive structure is um, skewed towards producing research very, very quickly because clocks are ticking. And I'm thinking about tenure clocks, promotion clocks, the timeliness of research certainly in some disciplines. By the time you get something, by the time you publish your book, because book publications take such a long time, your data are already outdated. Your data are already old. And so it can be really challenging to do this community engagement in the way that I think is ethical and necessary. It's quite important, but again, I want to emphasize what Beatrice said about the incentive structures. Like the incentive structures that we have in universities are simply not they're not supportive of the kind of like deep ethnographic, at least in the type of work that I do, ethnographic community engaged research, where the outputs would be beneficial to folks beyond the academy. Like that is not how our merit is measured within the academy, and that's a challenge, right? We have, I think, this normative moral orientation towards what we think of as being like good community-based, accessible research. And then we have the type of research that our institutions tell us we should be doing.
Are you saying that research that is connected to communities is just seen as less than? Is that really what you're saying?
Sometimes,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, sometimes, because the measure of our worth as scholars, right, the gold standard really is peer-reviewed research, right? And peer-reviewed research takes a long time. And so the type of scholarship that often has the most impact is precisely the type of scholarship that is not considered to be valuable given the standards of our disciplines and of universities. So just like as a really quick example, I have two monographs. One is on the census, and it was published by Cambridge University Press, which is a fantastic press, and it got me tenure, and it was read by 6 people. And I have another, no, really. And I have another book that was on, various bestseller lists, and it was published by Simon and Schuster. And I cannot use that for promotion because it's not peer reviewed. It's a trade press. Um, and
So
like I
that's
said,
wow to me. That's wow
thank
to
you.
me.
I do like both of my books, but there's a special place in my heart for my second book. But it's not peer reviewed, and fair enough. The peer review process is really, really important. It's a quality check on a lot of our research, absolutely. But our research also has to have impact beyond the academy. Like I absolutely agree with Beatrice about like the ivory tower. Our journal subscriptions cost a ton of money. They're inaccessible. Even that Globe article that you mentioned, if you don't have a subscription to the Globe, email me. I'll send you a copy. But
But if you don't, then you can't access it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So access is certainly a huge issue as well in thinking about our work with communities.
So we've mentioned a number of barriers. Are there any other barriers that you can think of, Beatrice, that keep academia disconnected from communities?
I would just underline really access to knowledge more generally, and I think the barrier of just thinking about university libraries and the fact that the majority of what is published out of universities are only available if you are attending a university.
Yeah.
Like that really makes a very clear town and gown distinction. It means that the like embedded places where universities are, somebody could live a block from that university and not have access to any of the things that are produced in that space. The majority of universities in Canada are publicly funded, and the public does not really have access to the knowledge that is produced there. And I think this is sort of a broad thing, but if we take seriously, Francis Bacon saying knowledge is power, what does it mean that knowledge is behind a paywall? That is a serious thing to grapple with and think about.
I'm looking at the time, so I'm going to move on to what is working right now and how some models can be scaled up. So we're going to move from critique to action. What is actually working? Like what strategies, Deb, I'm looking at you. What strategies or which models are actually moving the needle when it comes to civic engagement and scholarship?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. I guess it would depend on what your criteria for success is, So for those folks who are interested in making sure their research has an impact outside the ivory tower, then I would encourage them to engage in public scholarship as much as possible. For folks who are doing research where they want to impact communities or networks of stakeholders, then align your research accordingly. I think that the more that we in academia can evolve with the times, I think the better. And here I'm not just talking about emerging technologies, although as I said, that is a huge, huge issue that we should genuinely be concerned with. I mean, in our teaching methods, in the ways that we think about our own research, disciplines are slow to change. There's a lot of internal contestation. There is no agreement. There are huge debates within my own discipline about what the best kinds of methodologies and epistemological orientations are. And so I guess the thing that is working the best in Canadian political science at the moment, I would argue, is pluralism. Like we as a discipline, I think are quite open to various methodologies and various theoretical orientations. And when we come together at an event like the Congress of the Social Sciences and Humanities, which is happening next week at George Brown, very excited. It is this space where like you really do feel like universities are a marketplace of ideas, in spaces like that. And so I guess like the thing that's working is to continue to encourage all different kinds of research, different forms of debate as much as possible, and to really resist those impulses that lead towards a kind of hegemony in research paradigms.
What about you, Beatrice? What do you think is working?
So this is happening in small pockets, but it's really exciting to me, so I want to highlight it. I think one of the issues with social science and humanities now in the past decades has been that it has been presented in a binary with STEM. And this is getting back to something Deb said much earlier, which is, what about a student who goes to university and is like encouraged to do engineering, but they could be interested in taking a political science course? These have been treated as two completely separate things that you have to choose between, and not as different disciplines that actually intersect in lots of important ways, and how one of these disciplines can really help you understand another. There's research from the States, because it's easier to do this research in the States, because they have something that collects student voting data, but it shows that STEM students vote at a much lower rate than social science and humanities students. But that if you do interventions, if you interweave civic education curriculum into STEM classes, they vote at a higher rate. So there is a lot of really exciting work done that, the organization I was a part of, Student Vote Research Network, created something called Your Major on the Ballot, which talked about all of the different STEM fields and how things that were on the ballot related to the things they were studying and why it was so critical. So there are a lot of places that are experimenting with cross-curricular initiatives that really bring the relevance of humanities and social sciences into STEM fields. I'll say really quickly, the favorite guest lecture I ever did was in an infectious biology class where I talked about sleeping sickness in the Belgian Congo. They were understanding the biology of the disease, and I talked about the social factors in colonial Belgian Congo that led to the spread of the disease because of the enforced labor practices that forced enslaved Congolese people to work in these specific conditions that led to the spread of disease. So that was a clear place where sort of the social factors and the biology were both crucial to really understand what happened. And there's so many instances of that I think could be better supported and in our institutions.
Yeah,
That's
can I jump in on
fascinating.
that just really
Yeah.
quickly? So interdisciplinarity is such a great idea and really hard to execute in practice, because interdisciplinarity actually means that the people who engage in it have to know more than one discipline. And also the way in which, again, universities are structured it doesn't allow us, or myself as a social science faculty member, to engage very often with architects or engineers or folks in the hard sciences. But that's not necessarily true of all universities that I've worked at. And in one university in particular, there were these first year thematic seminars where they'd have a seminar that was called something like, "So you want to change the world." And the seminar would be only for first year students, and it would engage with faculty across the colleges, across the faculties, and it would be on this theme of, how do we affect meaningful change in the world given our different disciplinary orientations? And it was amazing. It was an amazing experiment. I got access to engineering and hard science students who were like, "Oh my gosh, political science is really interesting." And they showed up and they would take my courses as electives because that was possible, and also because I could pique their interest when they first came to university. So those kind of initiatives, they take leadership, and they also, again, rub up against some of the ways that universities are currently structured.
Well, let's talk about another initiative, our host, before we get to our last question. This one's for you, Beatrice. The Samara Center for Democracy is unique in that it's not for profit. It's a community-based organization. It takes an academic approach and lens when it comes to research. So how are you navigating the tension between academic rigor and public relevance?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I know we're coming up against time, so I'll try to be brief about it. But as Deb was talking about the sort of time pressure for academics, it's even more so for nonprofit research bodies. And I think that what's interesting is that it really forces you to be creative. I bring all of the methodological approach and the orientation that I have from my academic training, but we have to think in what we can produce in specific short time frames that is accessible and that has some clear, actionable element to it. And I think what's really distinct and different is that from the get-go, from when you're formulating the research question, you're thinking about not just the sort of argument, the thesis, but you're thinking about the form that it will be presented in to the audience. You're thinking so strongly about your audience and then shaping what you produce from that. And I think that is different from academia in that often in academia, your audience is assumed, which is your very specific colleagues in your field, and maybe colleagues slightly outside of your field, but generally colleagues in your field. And so it's different in both trying to maintain academic rigor. As Deb pointed out, it takes time and it really takes investment. I'll use the example of a recent project we had, our ongoing project, Verified, where we analyze political conversations online, particularly starting with the Canadian federal election. And that had to be really responsive. We were publishing weekly reports about what we were seeing online during the election. But our approach to it was to do as much as we could in preparation of the existing scholarly research beforehand to sort of ground ourselves in approaching what we saw. And I think the other thing that's very critical for us is, methodologically, we always include our methodological approach on everything, whether that's, it doesn't have to be geared to an academic audience. We want the public to understand how we approached our research and the choices we made and why, and citing everything, making sure everything is really well documented and really well cited so, people can understand how we came and formed our arguments and can themselves look into the topic. And so that's sort of the framework of our approach.
Thank you for that. And we're going to move to our very last question before we have some questions from the audience. Debra, in one sentence, looking ahead, what does the future of social sciences and humanities look like?
Gosh, we need to engage with new and emerging technologies. We need to continue to conduct ethical, community engaged research. We need to increase the ability to do interdisciplinary work, especially with the fine arts and STEM. And we need to defend democracy because it is under grave threat in this country and throughout the Western world.
Great sentence. Your
Thank
turn,
you.
Beatrice. What does the future of social sciences and humanities look like?
Deb covered most of it, but I say,
Cosign.
I will
Times
co-sign.
two.
I guess I will say in a more abstract way, I dream of it following Bell Hook's suggestion that education should be a practice of freedom, and that's what it looks like.
Well, that is a wonderful way to end the conversation. Thank you, Beatrice, and thank you, Deb. Let's move on. And I appreciate the questions that have come up earlier this week. The Samara Centre turned to the audience to find out the questions that they had about the role of the social sciences and humanities that they play in advancing civic engagement. I think I meant to just read this question. This is from Heather in Barrie, Ontario. What are the main constraints that scholars might see on their ability to support democracy, and which of them are malleable versus not? Who wants to take that?
Oh gosh, I can try. Scholars supporting democracy. So academic freedom is not an absolute. So there are limits, obviously, on things like hate speech. And I think that it is certainly a challenge, especially for marginalized folks across all disciplines, to continue to do research in an era of democratic backsliding, where there are very, very real risks for folks who do research that doesn't align with the orientation of a particular administration. And obviously, I'm thinking about the ways in which scholars are certainly in danger in America right now. And so the goal here, I think the importance here and how scholars can or scholars and faculty can support democracy is to continue to do work in spite of the dangers, to continue to produce good research, to teach our students the difference between good research and nonsense, frankly. in the face, even in the face of these dangers. I think that is important, and that is necessary, and it's a responsibility for us.
That's great. Thank you. Beatrice, this one's for you from Jacob in Toronto, Ontario. Which venues are most and least effective for scholars to make a positive impact on democracy? Is it the classroom, journal articles, events like these?
That's a good question. I mean, I would usually say, honestly, in the classroom for me, because it just feels so tangible. It seems you can run your classroom like a democratic space. There's so many options of not just in the methods you teach and the sources you read, but also in the way you engage in a classroom, where you can engage in teaching democracy by the way you act with your students. And I think that reaches, for me, I think it certainly reaches a bigger audience than my journal articles. Um, but I would
I
also
love it when we make jokes like that.
but I also would say maybe we can rethink classrooms in general. I think so many spaces can be classrooms, and the more
Mm,
spaces where scholars can get out into libraries, into community organizations, into more public spaces that aren't in the university, and have a classroom where they can share their knowledge in a way that is horizontal, is respectful, values the people who have come to see them,
mhm,
where you can have real conversations rather than lectures. I think maybe we can rethink where our classrooms can
mm.
be, and those can be great spaces of civic engagement.
Well, I enjoyed this classroom, and the class is over now. I'm going to pass the mic over to Sabrina with some closing remarks.
I enjoyed this class too. Thanks, Nanaba, Professor Duncan, and thank you to our panelists. It was such a pleasure to hear you unpack academic culture in this way and offer some really tangible ways forward to evolve the space in a way that results in democratic revitalization in Canada. So, who doesn't want more of that? Before we wrap up, staying on the theme of making civic engagement or civic knowledge more accessible and engaging, please check out the Samara Centre's new podcast. It's called Group Chat, and it's where we'll be bringing people together to make sense of what's happening in our democracy. Our trailer will be out next week. Please listen wherever you get your podcasts. And in closing, on behalf of the Samara Centre for Democracy and the Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences, thank you to everybody who joined us and for tuning in. Thank you.